Hello, everyone. Welcome to my remote lecture recital in fulfillment of my doctorate of musical arts at the University of Texas. I'm doing this remotely because of the pandemic and out of safety concerns. The history of brass mutes is of vital importance for understanding where my craft originated and the practices that led to our current mute designs. The early history of brass mutes is unclear because there's no written record of when a brass mute was first used. Historians do know that the first use of brass mutes in Western classical music comes from Monteverdi's L'Orfeo. Monteverdi composed L'Orfeo in 1607, and the muted parts that were in this piece were for the three trumpet players. So the mutes of this time were transposing mutes, and they raised the pitch of the instrument by either a half or a whole step. And these mutes were called wooden stoppers. And they're very similar to today's French horn stop mutes, both in design and the fact that they raise the pitch of the instrument. In 1738, a metalworker named Grafenstein crafted a pair of mutes. And they were metal mutes that were always in the bell. They were fixed. So no matter what passage, whether it was open or not, the mutes were in. And the players would push down on a lever whenever they wanted to activate the muting effect. So these mutes obviously would, go out of favor because of the limitations of, the mute always being stuck in the bell, especially by the time that the hand ring technique came about. Speaking of which, Anton Joseph Hampel developed the first known non-transposing horn mute, and this was between 1750 and 1755. During this time, he was also developing the hand ring technique that natural horn players would come to use. So one of the main reasons Hampel experimented for so many years was because of this acoustical phenomenon called end correction. And this has to do with the length of a resonance pipe and the amount that has to be added to get the precise pitch that you're looking for. So this comes into play with mutes by the volume of the mute. So this was a problem that I had early on. Actually, it's a problem that I just recently fixed. And that has to do with the taper of the cone. So if the cone is too thin, if the taper is too steep, the mute goes too far into the bell and the mute is sharp. So recently I came up with a new cone taper, this right here. And if you look at them side by side, you can see the difference in the cone taper. And you can especially see it with this mute right here, which is another one of my mutes. So once the cone taper was taken into consideration, there's the appropriate amount of volume inside the mute for the resonance to fill and for the right pitch to resonate. So there is obviously a problem with mutes and the natural horn, because another technique that Hampel developed was the hand ring technique. And while there was a mute in the bell, the hand ring technique could not be employed. So Carl Trilschmidt developed a mute that imitated Hampel's hand ring technique, but with limited success. So in this mute, there was a leather ball that would be close to the opening, and when the horn player wanted to simulate the hand muting technique, they would pull on a string and it would close off or open the opening of the mute, which simulated that hand ring technique. But like I said, there was limited success here. And although the mutes did work, it was not as effective as the actual technique. So Trilschmidt tried to get composers to write for this mute. He got Beethoven to write a couple pieces, but ultimately mutes fell out of favor because of the limitations of the natural horn. The invention of the valve made it possible for horn mutes to have a resurgence. Wagner was one of the first Romantic composers to write for the muted horn. Although during this time, quite a few horn players were still employing the hand muting technique instead of using actual mutes. So, one of the next major mute innovations happened in the 1920s. Parduba developed the first tunable horn mute. So, this is really important because mute makers have been innovating and making improvements on this design ever since. So, I have with me one of my tunable sections that I developed very recently. So, the base is birch, which is an environmentally friendly wood. And here we have 2 paper towel rolls that move in and out. There's 2 cylinders. And when you pull the cylinder out, it lowers the pitch of the mute. So Parduba made a tunable center, but it wasn't exactly like this. His mutes were metal, and they weighed 4 pounds. They were very heavy. And at the top of the mute, there was a section that you could pull in and out. So the actual tuning mechanism was in this part of the mute, as opposed to being attached to the base like the ones I make. And you can see an example of that right here. So the Parduba mutes were a massive leap forward because of the internal tuning system, but they were scarce. And most horn players could not find them. So that's when another mute maker came into prominence. This was Frank DePollis. He had the most successful design of the early 1900s, and he started developing his mutes in 1921. So his design was a cone on top of a cylinder, and this design has been widely copied. You can see here the Humes and Berg copy of the DePollis style mute. Carl Geyer developed this mute in 1942, and since then it has been a very popular mute on the market because of its availability and its price. Another prominent mute maker that deserves mentioning is Lorenzo Sansone. He had the first widely available tunable horn mute, and there were 2 models of his that were tunable. There was a metal one and a molded fiberboard mute. So both of these options were tunable. The metal one, you had to turn the top of the mute to tune the center, and the fiberboard one was similar to the Parduba mutes, where you pulled out the tunable section at the top. So the last mute maker I want to bring up in this section is Eugene Riddich. He developed a simple cone mute in the 1960s. His design has become the most popular and has been widely copied. I make Riddich style mutes. It's just a simple cone. And I found this particularly interesting because before studying the history of mutes, I didn't know the exact style of mute that I made. So now I know that I make Riddich style mutes. And these mutes, like I said, are very popular. Ian Ballou makes Riddich style mutes. Marcus Bona makes Riddich style mutes, as well as Dennis Wick and many other very prominent mute makers. So mute makers have been innovating this design ever since Riddich developed it in the 1960s. And mutes continue to get better and better because at that time in the 1960s, we really didn't have many options as horn players. That's why a lot of horn players were still using the hand muting technique. But today, we have a plethora of mute options. And I expect that that's only going to get better and better as time goes by and we learn more and more about the mute making process. Okay, so before I record this excerpt, I want to tell you why I'm recording this one. So, in Beethoven's Rondino, there is a moment where the horns don't really have the opportunity to switch mutes because there's just not enough time in the rests. So you have to use the hand muting technique to make this passage work. And then later on, you get enough time to actually put in a mute to finish the excerpt. So you'll get to see a very interesting display of hand muting and using actual mutes in this excerpt. In this section, we're going to discuss the construction of a straight mute and my own plans for innovating my designs moving forward after this project. So one mute I was particularly impressed with in the straight mute study was the Denniswick wooden tunable straight mute. For the price, this mute it's very well constructed. And initially, I intended to cut this mute open after the Soundwave experiments, but I like it so much I just can't do it. But luckily, Denniswick goes into great detail on their website what this mute is comprised of. So, the base is made of marine ply. The sidewall is made of birch and vulcanized fiber. And that second item was of particular interest to me because I need to find a way to make the sidewalls of my mutes a little bit firmer, a little bit harder. So, adding vulcanized fiber is one item I am considering. So, another item that I was working on is a tunable core to my straight mute designs. And when I interviewed Ian Ballou a couple months back, we discussed this. So, you're about to see a portion of my interview with Ian Ballou. What material do you use for the periscope?
You mean the tuning system, right?
That's correct, yeah.
It's the wood veneer. It's a different wood veneer.
Okay.
And then just like you tune the horn when you pull out the slide, the two cylinders. Now I know what you mean by periscopic. I call them like the tuning system. So if those two cylinders slide inside each other, whenever it gets longer, it's just like you would put the slide out of the horn, so the pitch would go lower.
Okay.
Now that is one of the problems with the tuning system, and you probably know that a lot of the mutes, as they age, the tuning system, it would just fall inside.
Oh, really?
Yes. So that's problematic, and that is the one thing that takes the longest time to make it right.
So that excerpt was the muted horn solo from Beethoven's Sixth Symphony. And I played it on one of my recent mutes. So right now, I want to talk to you about sound waves and how we are measuring them in the following experiments. So sound waves are movements of air molecules that our ears interpret as sound. One complete oscillation of a sound wave is called a cycle. Hertz measures the frequency of the cycle. 1 hertz is equal to 1 cycle per second. Cycles can also be referred to as vibrations. You can see here in this chart what I was just discussing. So, the frequency of a sound wave refers to the amount of cycles or vibrations per unit of time. The human voice averages a frequency of 1,000 hertz. This amounts to 1,000 vibrations per second. The greater the number of cycles per second means a higher frequency. The higher the frequency, the higher the pitch of sound. Generally, the audible range of frequencies for humans is between 20 hertz and 20,000 hertz. Sounds above this threshold are known as ultrasonic, and sounds below the threshold are known as infrasonic. So, what does this all mean for mutes? Simply, the higher the frequency, the brighter the sound of the mute. The lower the frequency, average frequency, the darker the sound. So we're going to be looking at a lot of average frequencies, and we're going to be measuring that with hertz in the coming experiments. So if you see a higher frequency, know that generally that means the mute has a brighter sound. And if the mute has a lower average frequency, it means it's a darker sound. Okay, so before I move on to the experiments, I want to talk to you all about what I think about when I'm listening for dark and bright sounds. So I'm going to use the open horn as an example of a relatively dark sound. And I'm going to use the stopped horn as an example of a bright sound. So you can easily hear the difference there. The stopped sound is very edgy, metallic, brittle, and bright, whereas the open sound is round, open, and just it's a darker sound. So as we're listening to the different mutes in the coming experiments, keep this in mind. Does the mute have an edgy metallic sound, or does it have a more diffuse, open, dark sound? Alright, the next section in this video is about the experiments I conducted. But before we get into the specifics, I want to show you how the data is displayed. On my left, you will see a screenshot of the EQ channel in Logic Pro X. Notice that horizontally, you can see the measurements in hertz from 20 to 20,000. One thing I have learned is that mutes typically amplify higher frequencies due to the fact that the mute acts as a Helmholtz resonator. Whenever a person blows across the top of a bottle to make a pitch, the bottle acts as a Helmholtz resonator. This is a big factor in why mutes produce higher frequencies than the open horn. The last part of the chart I want to point out is the decibel gauge that is on your right side of the chart. You will see that there's a little button you can push to raise or lower the decibel level, and that will be of particular importance to the third experiment. Alright, so let's look at the chart one more time. For this first experiment, take note of the highest frequencies. Look for more activity on the right side of the chart. Which mute do you think will produce the highest frequencies? Maybe a metal mute, like this Joe Rao? Or perhaps a wooden mute, like this Blue Music Straight mute? Let's find out together, shall we? let's go over the results of the first experiment. So I isolated the third note in the excerpt for the charts we're going to look at right now. The third note in the excerpt was the E flat. So the mute with the highest average frequency was the Marcus Bona, and that was 2050 hertz. And the mute with the lowest average frequency was the metal Dennis Wick non-tunable straight mute. And this one had an average frequency of 1200 hertz. So this was a surprise to me because I anticipated that the metal mutes would have a higher average frequency than the wood mutes. And the Joe Rao was a little bit brighter than the Dennis Wick, but generally it was darker than the wood mutes. So this was a surprise to me, and I'm sure a surprise to a lot of you. The purpose of this next experiment is to compare the sound frequencies of the open horn, the stopped horn, and two different stopped mutes. Now I anticipate we're going to see a higher average frequency in this experiment because for horn players, stopped horn is the brightest sound we make on the instrument. The excerpt I chose is from Mahler's Fifth Symphony. There's an identical passage that is passed between the corno obbligato and the first horn. The only difference is the first horn is stopped. So, in this experiment, which way do you think will produce the brightest sound, the highest frequencies? Do you think it'll be a stopped mute, or do you think it will be hand stopping? I doubt it'll be the open horn, so it's probably one of those two. Okay, after listening to all the options, which one do you think has the highest average frequency? To figure this out, we're going to be isolating the E natural in measures 301 for the corno obbligato and 303 for the first horn. So you should be able to see that right over here. The results are a little bit surprising. So the open horn had an average frequency of 2,675. So this is to be expected. It's a little bit louder than Brigadoon, so we're going to see a little bit higher average frequency because we're going to be picking up on more of those high frequencies. We're going to be going over that more in the next experiment, but that comes later. Okay, hand stopping. That produced an average frequency of 4,725. And this was a little bit surprising because, spoiler alert, it had a higher average frequency than the stop mutes. The Tom Crown stop mute had an average frequency of 3,700, and the wood stop mute had an average frequency of 3,975. But I will say this, even though the hand stopping produced a higher average frequency, it took a couple more takes for me to get a good recording of it. Whereas with the stop mutes, I got first take right away. So it produces a really similar sound between hand stopping and the stop mute for me at a fraction of the effort. So I recommend using a stop mute over hand stopping if you have the time for it in the music, because it's going to help you produce that high frequency, bright sound with less effort. Okay, this last experiment deals with practice mutes, and specifically, I am developing a mute for a friend in the Charlotte Symphony, whose name is Andrew Fiorovva. So I'm naming this mute after him. It's the Model E, or Fiorovva model. He wants a straight mute that is quieter than a normal straight mute, but louder than your typical practice mute. So the goal for the Model E Fiorovva mutes is to have a frequency range comparable to the Marcus Bona, but a decibel level that is in between the Marcus Bona and the practice mutes. So, in this experiment, we're using an excerpt from the Villanelle, which is a piece that was written for horn and piano. And in this excerpt, the horn is muted. So in this experiment, the muted horn, the Marcus Bona, is going to be our bass line. All right, let's see how it goes. Okay, let's go over the results of the experiment. First, let's talk about the excerpt. As you can see on my right, we are isolating the E flat that is in the second measure of this excerpt. So, when we look at the charts, we're going to be going over a few things that we didn't go over in the previous experiments, particularly decibel levels. So you're going to see two charts for every mute right now. So first, let's go over the Marcus Bona mute, because that's the baseline. So the Marcus Bona had an average frequency of 1,850 hertz, and its highest decibel level was 0 decibels. And when you're looking at this chart, 0 decibels does not mean that there's no sound. 0 is kind of the middle ground in these charts. And if you get below 0 decibels, then we're talking much quieter. And above 0 decibels, we're talking about louder sounds. So don't think about 0 decibels as no sound at all. Okay, so now we move on to the Yamaha silent brass mute. And this one, I think, is the most interesting mute in this study, because in the 0 decibel chart, it had a frequency, an average frequency of 775 hertz, and its its highest decibel level was at negative 20 decibels. So this mute was really, really quiet. And if you look at both the charts, it tells a really interesting story, because in the chart where the decibel level is elevated 20 decibels, you can see a much wider range of frequencies. So this tells me that the idea of my practice mute having the same frequencies as a straight mute is just not going to happen, because the decibel level needs to be lower. And the same thing is for my Model E Fiorovva mute. The average frequency is going to be lower for these mutes because the decibel level needs to be softer. Okay, moving on. So now let's talk about the Blue practice mute. This had an average frequency of 1,612 hertz, and its highest decibel level was at -5 decibels. So this mute is not quite as soft as the Yamaha, but it definitely is a contrast from the straight muted sound. It's definitely significantly softer. All right, now let's talk about my mutes. The Model C practice mute had an average frequency of 1,162 hertz, and its highest decibel level was 0.5 decibels. So my practice mute actually had a higher decibel level than the Marcus Bona, and this was in the lower frequency range between 200 and 500 hertz. It was just slightly louder, which obviously that's a problem. Practice mutes, ideally my practice mute would be around the -5 decibel level or lower. So I have some work when it comes to dampening the sound of my Model C practice mute. Okay, moving on to the Fiorova model, Model E. This one had an average frequency of 1,350 hertz, and its highest decibel level was at 0.5 decibels, just like my Model C. So both of these mutes really need work when it comes to dampening the sound, because ideally the Model E would be around -2 decibels. So I have considerable work to do there, but that's okay. That's why I'm doing these experiments. Okay, so before the end of this video, I would like to share some of my conclusions. And the first thing I would like to do is acknowledge the limitations of these preliminary experiments. In each experiment, there was only one note. So these preliminary experiments laid the groundwork for future, more detailed experiments that account for a wider range of both dynamics and the range of the instrument. There were a few things that I learned from these preliminary experiments, though, and I'm going to share a couple things right now. The decibel level influences the range of frequencies that we perceive. And we learned that from the Yamaha silent brass mute, where in the 0 decibel chart, we saw a really low average frequency, not very many peaks. But when we increased the decibel level by 20, all of a sudden we saw a much wider range of frequencies. So what this tells me is that practice mutes will inherently have a lower average frequency than straight mutes, because they have a lower decibel level. Okay, and one other thing I learned from the experiments is metal mutes are generally darker than wood mutes. And this was a surprise to me, like I already said. And I postulate that this is the case due to metal being more dense than wood, but that's just an educated guess. Okay, so now I'd like to talk to you about how I'm improving my mutes moving forward. Some of the things that I've already done and some of the things that I plan to do in the future. So one thing I've already done is I've adjusted the taper of my cones for horn mutes. And I've already talked to you all about this. Between my new cone taper and the internal tuning system, it's helped me account for end correction. And my latest horn mute is much better in tune than any of the horn mutes I've ever made before it, and it's due to these two factors. Okay, so beyond the playability of the mute, I'm also developing more environmentally friendly mutes. And right now I'm experimenting with the bass of the mute, and I've experimented with a bamboo bass and a birch, and I didn't really like the results, the sound quality of the bamboo. So now I'm moving on to birch. So both of these types of wood are relatively environmentally friendly because they grow really fast. And if I don't like what I see with the birch or hear with the birch, then I will move on to fiberglass. So another thing I'm doing to be environmentally friendly is I'm using recycled poster board for the cone, and I'm reinforcing that with vulcanized fiber. So both of those are, relatively environmentally friendly. And in the future, the next thing I'm going to work on after the cone materials is the cork I use for, the environmental environmentally friendly reason, and also to see if I can have the cork not squeak when you put the mute in the bell. That was one complaint that's been brought up. Okay, so I would like to thank my committee, Eon Ballou, Tom Crown, Nicholas Smith, Andrew Fiorova, Alex Fife, Karen Weston, Seth Orgel, and everyone who helped me with this project. Thank you.